Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today from wherever you are. I was absolutely delighted to accept Matt's invitation to produce this webinar for today's admin chat. And I'm coming to you at the moment from my home in Surrey in the UK, which for those of you who don't know, is about 30 miles southwest of central London, where I've been commuting from for the past few years. I've lived virtually my whole life in the countryside, and I definitely much prefer it over the city. So, who am I? Well, my name's Yvette Pearson, and for those of you who don't know me, I started working in financial services in administrative positions when I was just 18 years old, starting in a small stockbrokers. Back in those days, I actually lived more than 50 miles outside of London, and working in the big city wasn't really what people from where I lived did. However, enthusiastic little me decided that that's what I wanted to do. And so I got myself some meetings with recruitment agencies. I printed out some maps to each one, because smartphones and Google Maps on my phone didn't exist back then. And I trotted off to this big scary city where I'd actually only ever been before, when I'd gone to the theatre on school trips. So after getting a job interview that very same day, I was offered the job, and I started working in London the very next week. And it really, really was as quick as that. And I know that it's definitely not like that anymore. After a year at that stockbroking firm, I went to work at Credit Suisse. I was just 19 years old when I started here, and on my very first day, I remember arriving in Canary Wharf and seeing the building. They had their own designated office, the whole building they owned, and I took a photo of the office because I was so proud that I'd got what I thought was such a prestigious job, although I do realise that prestige somewhat diminished soon after 2009, whereby all of my family started asking me whether it was my fault that there was a global financial crisis. About 6 years later, I moved to Hermes Asset Management, not the bag company, unfortunately. It was the company which was set up to invest the pension fund of British Telecom. It was here that I was PA to the COO. The COO is actually a gentleman I work for today, after our paths crossed a few years later. I joined my current role at adminchat back in 2015, and I initially joined as the office manager and the PA to the management team. It was a really exciting startup, fast growing, loads of things going on. No 2 days were the same. I know we all say that, but they really, really weren't. For the past 18 months, I've been heading up our business intelligence team here at adminchat. I do know, I do realise that sounds like I work for MI5. Unfortunately not. But I never thought in a million years that I would end up doing a role like this. I don't have a degree. I didn't even finish college. But what I do have is drive, and I never ever lost that drive and ambition. And I'm constantly trying to do new things and create value in absolutely everything that I'm doing. I'm really proud to be part of the Executive Secretary Speaker Bureau. Please do get in touch if you would like me to come along to your office and present to your colleagues. I've had the great honour of speaking in several different countries and also around the UK. I love the gym, and a bit of a fun fact about me is that I once competed in a bodybuilding competition. And most recently, I've just written my first book, Confessions of a PA. This was probably my proudest moment to date when this got published. And if you are interested in getting hold of a copy, you can get it from my website, which you'll see details of at the end of this presentation. So one of the things that's helped me over the years in all my different roles is learning about how body language can help me tell how people are really feeling, even if their words are telling me that they're okay. I wanted to look into this and see how I can use it at work specifically. And so I'm going to be talking to you about what body language signs you can look out for and which things you can help you deal with different types of situations around your office. All of these tips and theories I've tried out in my own office. So I'm only sharing with you the things which I have tried and tested myself on my own guinea pigs, I mean colleagues. So first of all, what is body language? Body language makes up a whopping 55% of all of our communication. Interestingly, the words we use make up just 7%, which can go some way in explaining why our emails and our texts can so often be taken out of context and not taken in the way that we initially meant them. My general rule now in life, after learning about this, is to first and foremost assume that the sender of the email or the text is kind and genuine. I consciously try and take their words in the best way that I possibly can. So often we take things in the worst possible way. We assume that someone is mad or angry at us, or we assume that they're being patronising or even passive aggressive, when in reality we're actually adding in our own feelings or even our own guilt if we think we've done something wrong, which aren't necessarily the feelings or the sentiment of the sender. Body language is almost always subconscious. Even the best actors can't hide or change their body language all of the time. It's something that we all do so naturally and without even thinking about it. We also pick up on it subconsciously too. Think about how many times you've thought that somebody was annoyed at you before they'd even said a single word to you. Or how often do we feel that we know what somebody's going to be like before we've even had a conversation with them? That's because we've learned over many years how people's body languages make us feel. When I tell people that I've studied a lot of body language, the most common reaction I get is for them to instantly stand up straight and ask me what their body language is telling them. But honestly, it's not like that at all. I have to be consciously looking for it to be able to think about what it means. I quite often stop myself in the middle of doing something and have a look at my own body language and think about how I feel at that precise moment. So let's take a look at some common examples of body language. A really common example is somebody folding their arms. You've probably seen people folding their arms in frustration or annoyance. They're typically using their arms as a barrier to protect themselves. They might feel insecure, they could be feeling vulnerable, or it could be because they're in complete disagreement with what you're saying. They're putting up a barrier between themselves and whatever it is that's making them feel uncomfortable. So if I were delivering this webinar as a live presentation and you were all in the room watching me, think about how it would come across if I was standing there with my arms folded. I'd probably come across as quite closed, quite unwelcoming. If I was to then open up my arms, it opens up my body to you and invites you into what I'm saying. This also helps you, the audience, absorb more information as well. There was actually a study done with some university students and half of the students were given chairs without armrests, and the other half had chairs with armrests. They were given a talk and then asked questions about it afterwards. Those students without arms on their chairs had a much higher proportion of them folding their arms than those with armrests, unsurprisingly. But what we found was those students who had their arms folded not only absorbed about 40% less information, the information that they did absorb was overwhelmingly the negative stuff rather than the positive stuff. So what can you do about this in an office environment? Well, I've taken these examples and have explained this to our events team. And I've explained how important it is that when we're organising conferences, that the chairs, if possible, have arms on them. I gave this talk to a group of teachers in Luxembourg earlier in 2019 and explained that it could help their students, their children, if they didn't ask them to fold their arms while they were being spoken to, as it would help them absorb more of the information and more of the things that are being said to them. Of course, as with all body language, it's really important to look at it in its wider context. With something like folded arms, we could do this just because we are cold. And if this is the case, we typically will compensate for this by leaning forward to the person speaking in order to counteract the barrier that we are putting up. We're effectively putting our head past the barrier to remove it from the situation. The next example I'm going to talk to you about is quite often trickier to spot, and it's crossing their ankles. The reason why it's trickier to spot is because we're more likely to be sitting down when we do this and therefore being blocked by a table. Although most of us are expected to be mind readers, so what's a bit of X-ray vision between friends, eh? We often cross our ankles when we're holding information, not necessarily because we are lying, but perhaps because we are too shy to speak up. Another study was done, this time with passengers on an aeroplane. It was found that the majority of people who wanted cabin service but were too shy to ask for it had their ankles crossed. And now some cabin crews are trained to try and pick up on this and try and be a bit more proactive in asking people if they need anything. I actually tried this out a few times when some clients came into our office, and I asked those who were sitting down in our reception if they would like a drink. Our reception has a couple of little sofas and nothing that would block their feet from my view. I asked them if they would like a drink, and the majority of those who had their ankles crossed either said no or that they would just have a glass of water. Those sitting with their ankles uncrossed were far more likely to ask for a cup of tea or a coffee, or even something really exotic like a peppermint tea. Funnily enough, several of those people who declined my initial offer changed their mind when they asked if they were sure they wouldn't want a tea or a coffee. I made an effort to give them another opportunity, which a lot of them accepted. Again, taking this into context, there is a chance that this position could simply be more comfortable, or you could just be a female member of the British royal family who are expected to sit with their ankles crossed when at public engagements. Have a look next time you see them when they're out. Another example is face touching, and there are lots of different places on our faces that we touch quite frequently that can mean slightly different things. Typically, it's likely to be someone seeing or hearing something that they don't like or don't agree with, or trying to prevent themselves from saying something. Looking about covering our eyes, covering our faces, think about when you are watching a scary film. If you're like me, or you probably wouldn't watch it in the first place, but you would cover your face with your hands, cover your eyes up. You could just close your eyes, which would have pretty much the same result, but it's our subconscious which is telling us to protect our eyes from what we're seeing. A more subtle example of this is rubbing your eyes. If we are in a presentation and we don't like what we're seeing, covering our eyes up as though we were watching someone's head being cut off would be a little bit over the top. So hopefully none of you are doing that right now. So what we tend to do is rub our eyes a little bit, or generally speaking, in the case of ladies who might be wearing makeup, we'll just touch very gently underneath our eye, or we flick our eyelashes. Covering up our ears is very often a practical way of stopping a loud noise from hurting our ears. Of course, this can physically help if the noise is very loud, but it's also our subconscious telling us to protect ourselves from the story or from the information that we don't want to hear. Covering up our mouth is typically a sign that we are trying to cover up perhaps some deceitful words that are being said, or things that we've said unintentionally. If you think about when you accidentally let slip a secret and you immediately cover your mouth in horror that you've said something that you shouldn't have done. Apparently this picture here of Tom Hanks, it was when he had just accidentally sworn on live TV. So sometimes covering something deceitful is not necessarily your hand covering your mouth so obviously as in the case of Tom Hanks here, but it can also be in the form of a fake cough, which is an attempt at giving a potentially legitimate reason for covering your mouth. Of course, it could be a genuine cough, but you can normally tell if it isn't. We also cover our mouths with a shush gesture that we're often asked to do by our teachers or parents when we're little. As an adult, this gesture is an attempt to not say what we are really thinking or feeling, and we're stopping ourselves from talking. There's a guy I work with who does this an awful lot in meetings, and I'm desperate to know what's going through his mind. When I see him doing this in one of my meetings, I make a point of asking him for his opinion. And if he says something and then covers his mouth or coughs, then I know that he means the exact opposite. A bit sneaky, I know. So where people sit in meeting rooms can also tell you quite a lot about how the meeting is going to pan out. There are some key seats around a table which can determine how people are likely to behave. It all stems around how the seat that the person chooses to sit in makes them feel. If someone is sitting right by the door in a meeting room, it's quite a subtle way of suggesting that they are the person that wants to make a very quick exit. There's somewhere else that they want to be, or they just want to be anywhere but in that meeting. They're also likely to be a quieter person who is less likely to speak up and less likely to ask questions. You might think that the person who is in charge of the meeting is most likely to sit at the head of the table. And this isn't quite true. The person who feels like they are most in charge of the meeting is likely to position themselves, assuming that they are one of the first people in the room, at whichever seat is furthest away from the door while still facing it. And this seat gives them the best view of the whole room and gives them command of it. And I like to call this the power seat. So looking at this top-down view of a meeting room, you can see that the door is in the top right-hand corner, and this is an image which was the closest likeness to the boardroom in my office at work, and I mean our room has 3 seats at either end, so it's a bit bigger than this one, but it's pretty much the same shape. I used to attend weekly meetings with our credit team where I would often have to bring up documents onto the screen. And the screen here is shown by the vertical line on the right-hand side. I used to sit myself in the seat closest to the door for the simple fact that the mouse and the keyboard are at that seat. There was no other reason for me to sit there. So one week, I had no documents to show. And so to test this theory, I went and sat in the power seat, diagonally opposite the door, which I've highlighted with a little circle in case that wasn't obvious. As people one by one walked into the room, every single person stopped at the door and asked either what was happening or whether they were in the right meeting. The whole dynamic of the meeting changed as soon as I sat in that seat. It was absolutely staggering, the difference that it made. So how can you take this and use it at work? Well, if there's somebody who is quite loud or tries to take over meetings, and we all know somebody like that, try, if you can, to seat them closest to the door. Likewise, if you are trying to get that quiet person to speak up a little bit, try and sit them furthest away from the door in the power seat, which could give them that little bit of extra confidence to say something. And this can be applied really well, again, if you are hosting something like a private dining event. It's also worth noting where an interview candidate sits when they're invited to go into a room first. If you're anything like me, you go into an interview and you walk into this empty room and you suddenly freak out about which seat you want to sit in because you're not quite sure how the interviewer is going to read where you've sat. The more confident candidates are likely to sit themselves opposite the door. If it's a large room like this one, it's unlikely they're going to sit all the way around in the power seat. They'll probably sit themselves in the seat opposite the door, just sort of here. The quieter ones will probably sit really, really close to the door. But then you get those people who don't actually sit down at all and they wander around the room until you get there. They are your salespeople right there, keeping their cards really close to their chest. The behaviour of people in the room also gives some great indicators of how they feel, and none more so really than where they put all their stuff. A great example of this is when you are sitting in a restaurant with a partner or a friend. Typically you're sitting opposite each other. And when you go and sit down, normally there will be glasses and cutlery and maybe even a little vase on the table if you're somewhere fancy. And then there's the salt and pepper shakers. Potentially a bit later on in the evening, there might be a wine bottle or three and a water jug. None of these things you initially put down, but we move pretty much all of them during our dinner at some point. I was having dinner with my partner recently, and no sooner had we sat down, he moved the salt and pepper shakers to the side of the table. They weren't tall, they weren't in our way, but he was removing all of the barriers between us. He wanted us to be open with each other. And it really made me laugh throughout the evening because I was purposely putting things back right in the middle of the table for research, of course. And he would systematically move them back to the side. And at one point, he even moved a crumb. I kid you not, he'd moved a crumb across the table. When I actually asked him about this afterwards, he had absolutely no recollection whatsoever of moving anything. And we do this in meetings with our pen, with our glass of water, with our cup of coffee. You can tell the person who is uncomfortable in a meeting because they will practically barricade themselves behind whatever they can get hold of. They'll build themselves into a little fort. So you can help this a little bit by getting the shortest cups and glasses that you can find, and putting things like pen pots and pads of paper onto a side table if you have one. Sitting on your hands is quite often somebody being typically unobjectionable to what's being said. Whilst this could possibly be read as a sign that they are quite disinterested in what's going on in the meeting, more often than not, it's a sign that they are quite accepting. They are remaining open. They're not creating a barrier between themselves and the person speaking, and they are leaving themselves open to absorbing everything, and trying not to cover up any part of themselves that might suggest that they didn't like what they were seeing or hearing. If they were disinterested in the meeting, they will be more likely to be on their phone, doodling on their notepad, or staring out of the window. So how can you take advantage of body language? And what can you do when you pick up on some of these signals whilst you are in a meeting? First of all, you can try and engage those people who are showing signs of being not very interested, those who are quieter or doodling, and try and bring their attention back into the room. You can ask them a question, but try not to make it look like you're trying to trip them up. Quite often you'll see somebody talking and then all of a sudden they'll say, "Bob, what do you think?" knowing full well Bob has not heard the last 10 minutes of what's being said. So say the name of the person and then ask their question, and so you're not making them ask you to repeat the question. It just embarrasses them and doesn't help them in any way. You can try and break down some of the barriers that people have put up. I don't mean by asking everyone to hand in all of their stuff before they sit down, although handing in phones might be a good idea. But what you can actually do is, if you are hosting the meeting, you can actually move around the room. If the room's big enough, try and walk all the way around it, because no one's barriers are going to give them 360 degrees of protection. There's always going to be a little bit of an angle where there's no barrier at all. You can try and empower the shy person who has sat themselves by the door. If they do make a comment or ask a question, tell them that their view is valid first and foremost, even if you have to go on to explain that they're wrong. It's also worth looping them in by asking them a question if you can see from their facial expression that they're interested, if they're nodding, smiling even. Finally, if everyone in the room is doodling or on their phones, which I really hope you guys aren't doing by now, you may as well just simply end the meeting and send an email instead. If no one's listening to you, there is literally no point in continuing to speak. You're just wasting your own time. So they are my top tips for reading people's body language. I want to just take a moment to say thank you for joining me on my webinar on body language, or if you are watching it on the Executive Secretary YouTube channel. I really, really hope you found it useful. Please do reach out to me if you've got any questions or comments about what I've been speaking about. And you are very, very welcome to connect with me on all of the social media, except Snapchat. I'm not 17, unfortunately. For those of you who are interested in my book that I mentioned earlier, you can find it on my website at the top there. And the link to my Executive Secretary bio is at the bottom. So thank you again for listening, and I really do hope to speak to you soon, and I look forward to hearing your comments and your questions. So thank you very much, and goodbye.